Hello and welcome to Ethics in the News. My name is Hannah Storm and I'm the director of the Ethical Journalism Network. In this edition I'm speaking with Jonathan Heawood. He's the executive director of the Public Interest News Foundation, and I began by asking him what are the key challenges faced by independent news publishers during the COVID pandemic.
Well, for independent publishers, life was not a sort of bowl of roses before the crisis. We're talking about small organisations, turnover might be in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pounds, perhaps a few members of staff, fairly low overheads, but nonetheless costs and challenges raising income, whether that was through advertising or subscriptions, even in the best situation. But when the crisis hit, suddenly those income lines went down immediately. Someone said advertising just fell off a cliff, but at the same time workload went up. And what you're seeing, particularly for these smaller sites online that are reaching audiences, in some cases in the hundreds of thousands or even in the millions, is that their traffic is spiking as people are turning for information, hungry for information about the pandemic and the lockdown and all the associated implications of that. And these publications are racing to meet that need, and they want to keep reporting on what's going on around them. But the perverse consequence of that is that they then can't benefit from any of the government schemes which are designed to support businesses which are not operating through the crisis. So at the moment, the government really sees businesses in terms of either providing an essential service, which would be parts of the public sector, health, education, or parts of the private sector like the food business, where there's money still flowing through the supermarkets and producers because people are still buying food, or they just think, okay, businesses aren't operating, they're not making money, so they're going to be shut down. But news organisations fall completely between those two stools. They're not making money, but they definitely don't want to shut down. So they're not able to benefit from those forms of government support, whether it's furloughing workers or loans. They don't want to take out loans because they don't make much money anyway. So all they'd have to do with a loan at some point is pay it back. So we've done a survey of publishers which found that the majority are going beyond traditional reporting in their response to the crisis. So they're busier than ever. They're not just reporting, they're also, for instance, helping to convene volunteering work in their communities, or they're helping to provide an information hub about all the businesses that are doing home deliveries, or they're providing a forum for people to engage with their local councillors. So they're doing all sorts of things above and beyond journalism. The vast majority are experiencing a negative economic effect. 3/4 told us that they were concerned that they might have to go out of business, and 95% are not benefiting from any kind of government support. So you've really got a perfect storm for the sector.
Talk to me a little bit more about this idea of independent news publishers providing much more than just information for communities. What did you find when you ran your survey in terms of what they were doing to bring together communities, obviously remotely, during this crisis?
It's quite surprising stuff. It's not necessarily the stuff that you would expect. So, for instance, one publisher told us that the service that they were providing, that people were really valuing, was allowing people to compare notes on which local businesses, shops or others that were open were actually observing social distancing. So that they had so people could quickly, if they were particularly nervous about infection, people could quickly go onto this forum and see, is it safe to go to supermarket A or supermarket B or the greengrocers or the butchers, or am I likely to be in a place where I'm not going to feel safe because they're not really respecting social distancing? It's not exactly reporting on it. They weren't necessarily sort of publishing that in the form of one-off stories. It was an ongoing dynamic map of where was safe and where wasn't so safe.
But it's providing a platform for information provision, isn't it, where members of the community can make informed decisions. And I think that's probably an area of journalism, perhaps, or news provision that we don't contemplate unless we're in crisis.
Exactly. And it's also one of the things that I think is so exciting about this sector is that because they're so small, they can be quite nimble. So, for a big old media institution to develop something like that might take weeks and planning meetings and cost benefit analysis and risk analysis and legal and all the rest of it. But small organisations just do it. So they are in a position to innovate in quite interesting ways. A lot of the time in the last few years, media policy debate has been about the difference between publishers and platforms and the different liabilities of publishers and platforms. And actually, if you're a small online news / information reporting / sharing site, you are a bit of a publisher and a bit of a platform, and you can sometimes do the best of both.
Some of these independent publishers support communities that are potentially more vulnerable. And as we've seen with COVID-19, yes, it impacts on everyone, but the most vulnerable people in society are those who are most impacted. So how important is that consideration when you think about the independent news publishers who you work with?
It's quite fundamental to most of them for various reasons. So at a local level, where you tend to find vibrant independent publishers is in the very places that the big companies that own most of the older local newspapers have abandoned. Newspaper groups have pulled out of a range of post-industrial towns in the northwest, in South Wales, parts of the country that are very economically deprived, and you'll have very high levels of people with suffering all sorts of forms of deprivation and all the associated impacts that you then see in terms of health and so on. So those publishers have pulled out of those areas because they're not economically viable. They don't generate the volume of advertising that those publishers need to sustain the profit margins that they're looking for. So by their very nature, it's those areas that the small independent publishers have then gone into, quite often actually set up by journalists who might have previously worked for the local newspaper, got made redundant when it was closed down, or it was perhaps merged with another title in a town 20 or 30 miles away, and the newsroom was moved perhaps to another town, a hub 50 or 60 miles away. So journalists get made redundant, but they're really embedded in their communities. They've set up their own independent site, and because they're just looking to break even, they can just about make it work. So that's one way in which those sorts of publications are just naturally in those sorts of left behind places. And then you also get publications in the independent sector that are particularly focused on different BAME communities in the UK, so whether that's people from a South Asian background or British Muslims or Polish speaking groups, or any one of a vast number really of different groups that are in the UK, you'll tend to find there's a specialist publication led by people from that community and aimed at that community. So in a range of ways, the independent sector, because people in this sector are not usually looking to generate big profits or dividends, they're simply looking to break even, often working with a combination of professional and voluntary support. So they are able and willing to go to the places that the bigger corporate media is not able or willing to go. So as you say, it's precisely those groups that might otherwise get left behind and might then not get the benefit of government messages about how to stay safe and what distancing rules to observe and so on.
Tell me a little bit about some of the work and priorities that the Public Interest News Foundation has taken on board. I mean, you're really new, aren't you? You were only literally set up on just as the COVID pandemic was starting. So how have you developed and understood what your priorities are when faced with such a great crisis?
Public Interest News Foundation really only started work on the 1st of March this year, and within 3 weeks of that we were working from home. It was an idea that was developing over the previous 2 years. So in Britain in 2018 the government launched something called the Cairncross Review, looking at the sustainability of public interest journalism. We gave evidence to that review and coordinated the response of the independent sector and spoke a lot to Frances Cairncross, who led the review, and her advisors. And we continued to work on that work programme after the review formally ended last February 2019, and Frances Cairncross recommended to the government that they should create a new institute for public interest news that would raise funding to support public interest journalism, to support innovation, and particularly to support local journalism. And these were all areas where she felt there was a really quite profound market failure that was possibly only going to get worse without some kind of public intervention. The government said they weren't going to launch that institute. So we, having been having those conversations for a long time anyway, and having been working closely with the independent sector, we felt that was a terrible missed opportunity if nothing was created. So we took some of the ideas that were set out in the Cairncross review, but developed them in a way so it's not the kind of public body, it's not the government body that she was recommending, it's an independent charitable foundation. And also the other thing that we've really developed is that our focus is much more on the independent sector, so on publishers in general with turnover. I mean, at the very largest, we're talking about publishers who might have turnover of £2 million a year, but in most cases it's going to be a lot lower than that. And our reckoning is that there's something between 200 and 300 publishers in the UK who operate at that size, with that independence and with a kind of strong commitment to public interest journalism of one kind or another. And what came out of our conversations with people in the sector was that if, when we said, look, we're interested in creating this new body, we'd like to take forward some of the ideas that came through the Cairncross review around funding and support for public interest journalism. What people were saying to us was that certainly would value money. I mean, these are struggling organisations that could really benefit from some investment and grant funding. But as much as that, it became really clear that people would value from kind of leadership development, coaching and mentoring, because the typical profile in the sector is a small organisation launched by someone who's really passionate about journalism, but doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of experience of running organisations or fundraising or business development or working with tech or really thinking about community engagement. There are some people in the sector who've got some of those skills and not others, and there are other people who've got different skills, and it's a patchwork. So we got a strong message that people would love there to be a foundation that was dedicated to supporting them, that it would provide funding, but on top of that, it would also provide all that kind of leadership development and networking to help them share experiences.
This is a situation that has turned the news industry, the traditional news industry, on its head, completely on its head. And, we're nearly all working from home. We're finding ways to innovate, as we've discussed. But for small news publishers, I'm interested in two things, really. One is, what can they teach us about innovation, as in us, the traditional media industry, and what practically are you doing to support them? What are they crying out for at this moment in time?
I think one of the things that you see that is incredibly heartening and productive is that they're very non-competitive in the independent sector. Now, partly that's because they're not necessarily competing for the same audiences, because they're defined by different localities or different communities of interest. So they can afford to be collaborative, but nonetheless, they are instinctively very open with each other. I was on a call earlier today with a group of publishers, one of whom has, throughout the last few weeks of the crisis, has been really accelerating their efforts to launch a new reader donation scheme, and was just very honestly and openly sharing their experiences and lessons and tips with the other publishers, which is something I think you'd be surprised to see in the corporate sector. So they're very, very collaborative and collegiate and open with each other, which, to be honest, goes hand in hand sometimes with a lack of commercial experience of the kind that you would find. So it's just, it's a strength and a potential weakness. What they want from us is essentially, at a time like this, is a voice. I mean, what they lack as a sector is what traditional media is very good at, which is putting the ability to put pressure on government. So in the UK, the big newspaper companies all they compete commercially, but when it comes to their joint interests, they are quite good at joining up and going to government and presenting a pretty powerful united front. So as the crisis broke at the end of March, beginning of April, the big newspaper groups all went to the government and said, look, we need your support, we need money. And the government then unlocked £35 million, which is nominally to fund public health advertising, but almost all of that so far has gone into those corporate newspaper groups, and it has not gone to the small independent publishers that are reaching those otherwise quite easily forgotten corners of the country.
Are you acting as the umbrella that brings these organisations together, the place where these organisations can have a joint voice? How does that work?
We are playing that role. There's another organisation, very good organisation, the Independent Community News Network, or ICNN, which does represent what you might call the hyperlocal end of the sector, the local and hyperlocal publications, whereas, as I said, we're interested in every aspect of the independent sector, including the BAME publications and investigative and political and so on. Between us, yes, we are essentially advocating for the sector. That wasn't exactly the role that we'd anticipated the foundation playing, because we thought we would have more time and that our emphasis would be on fundraising to build up a fund that we would then use to build capacity for publishers. But given this is where we are, and that the people that we're trying to support are telling us that they desperately need government support and they're falling through the cracks, we are at least, we do have contacts and relationships with ministers and officials and MPs and members of the House of Lords. So we're able to try to use our position to raise the concerns of the sector and to act as, at least as a sort of point of contact. It's proving very difficult, but we're doing what we can, and we're starting to see some progress in terms of getting some support down to where it's most needed.
We've spoken in the past about some of the funding you're trying to access to support organisations. I've seen that you have this hashtag Save Independent News. What are the practical things, for want of a better word, are you offering the members of your network?
So Save Independent News that's the name we've given to this campaign. So essentially that's everything we're doing that's COVID related, that's about calling on funders and government to support, whether it supports funding or other kinds of support for the sector. We're doing a number of calls every week or two. We have a Zoom call with people within the sector, partly just for information sharing, to see who has successfully managed to get any funding so far. Google and Facebook have both launched big funding initiatives at a European or a global level, so we were checking in with people earlier today to see if anyone had actually benefited from that. It looks like the vast majority haven't, so there's partly information sharing, trying to alert people to opportunities.
Where do you see the real need for members of your network?
You've got some publishers who are really technically innovative and don't know much about journalism. You've got others who are fantastic journalists and don't know much about tech. You've got some who come from a community organising background and don't know much about business development. I think the biggest opportunity and challenge is to get the expertise that is already there within the sector and share it. There's huge appetite for that, but there's no forum, there's no capacity, there's no means for doing it. So one of the exciting things that's going on at the moment, and I'm doing this just as a punter, is I've been signing up for some online learning courses, and I think loads of people are doing this during lockdown. They've got time on their hands and people are bored and are taking the opportunity to learn new skills. I think there's a lot that we could be doing to share skills, and then you're having a double benefit then. You're developing the confidence of the people who are actually sharing their skills. They are starting to feel like experts, and you're skilling up the people on the receiving end. So some of it is simply within the sector, and then you've got people outside the sector. So on the board of the new foundation, we've been really glad to get so far. It's a small board to start with, just enough to get it moving. But we've got people like Isabel Rujol, who was the editorial director of LinkedIn, and Joe Adetunji, who's the deputy editor of The Conversation, formerly at The Guardian. So you've got people who have got quite high-level skills in working with platforms, understanding how to really work social media, understanding how to work with civil society and academics to commission really high-caliber content. So those are the kinds of people that we would then see as mentors who would be able to come into the sector, train people up. I think the long-term scenario is that there's a real risk that this heavily concentrated corporate newspaper industry in the UK is really on its last legs, and it's very hard to see all of the groups that are currently operating surviving beyond the next few years. That was true pre-crisis. It's even more true now. So either the big corporates will consolidate even further, and you'll have an even greater narrowing of voice and engagement in the newspaper industry, or they will start to close and collapse, And you'll just get these news deserts expanding across the country and further disengagement and people switching off.
So if we have these news deserts, this is exactly the kind of place where the publishers who you're supporting can really rise to the fore.
To extend that metaphor of the news desert, you think about, well, how do you turn back desertification in areas where the land has been stripped to the bone? You have to bring in new topsoil and plant new trees and undergrowth and sew back together the ecosystem that has been plundered. I mean, it's very, very comparable to what we are setting out to do. You find the tiny bits of growth that are still there where people have taken it upon themselves to plant some kind of independent news site, and you cultivate that. You work with the grain of what is there, develop the strengths that they've got, try and plug some of the gaps they've got. And the happy vision down the line is that rather than having an increasingly sort of desertified news ecosystem in the UK, actually you might have an increasingly varied and rich ecosystem with different kinds of sites and publication filling different pockets but working together. And in some ways, just finally on that, I think the other interesting thing that you hear a lot from these small publishers that they would love us to do is to develop shared infrastructure. So you can do the mentoring and networking to help them develop their skills and share their skills. But also with some shared infrastructure, they could be doing joint advertising sales, where suddenly they go from being a large number of quite small organisations with a few tens of thousands of readers each to being a block with a reach of maybe 15 million readers, which suddenly starts to look a lot more interesting to big advertisers. Also shared editorial platforms where you've got a publisher in one end of the country doing a story about knife crime and a publisher at the other end of the country also, as it happens, doing a story about knife crime. And then you've got an investigative non-profit doing something about government policy or police spending, and suddenly they could, if they had some access to some shared platform, they could see those different stories coming through and start to work together on specific projects or mutually linked to the different stories. So you suddenly start to see a sector where the weakness is the fact that it's atomized and spread around, but if you can just sew it together a bit, you've got a potentially really exciting way of generating news from the bottom up, from where stuff is happening, and then making it speak so that it's more than the sum of its parts.
And that was Jonathan Heawood speaking with me there.